Hello, Alyssa. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday.
All right, here we are. We are 8 days out from the election. It's become kind of a ritual for you and I think, where I pop in on Mondays and you and I do a temperature check about how things are going and where we think the election's leaning. So I'm going to ask today, I've already asked you privately, but today on camera, how do you feel about it right now?
So I feel the most confident I have to date that Kamala Harris is going to win.
Right. I think a week ago, you and I both were like, this doesn't feel good.
There was movement that I was feeling. It's a vibe election. There was vibes that made me feel like it was moving toward Trump, and something shifted, a couple things. I'll say all this. For the next weekend or the next 8 days, I'm just going to have a stomach ache. Like, I'm nervous because this is way closer statistically than any election we've had. But the key demos are in her favor, and I don't see those fundamentally changing. So ABC had some polling from this weekend that showed with women of, any demographic, she has a 12-point lead. Donald Trump has a 9-point lead with men, but that's a bigger lead that she has. So as far as the gender gap goes, she has more support. She's doing better with Gen Z, millennials, and elderly Americans. It's only the boomers, actually, who are the boomers and some of Gen X that are favoring Trump. She's doing what she needs to. The end of the final stretch of an election is your closing message and reminding people why they shouldn't be with your opponent. She's doing that. She's going to do this speech on the ellipse about the dangers in January 6th, but then she's also talking to communities. She's in Michigan, she's in Wisconsin about her plans. Trump gave this crazy rally that was unlike anything I've ever seen, and I think it's pretty much the worst closing message and a reminder of people feeling like he's not like us. So I feel like she's going to win, but I'm curious what you think.
Again, and I'm not an expert. I'm I have avid interest, and I'm paying attention to things, and I agree with you. It's vibes, but vibes are hard to read. I mean, 2016 vibes were very different than it ended up being. I remember being very nervous that Mitt Romney was going to beat Obama, which you were probably rooting for at that point in your career. But do you remember that day? Did you feel pretty confident, or did you feel like...
You know what? I thought that the data seemed like Romney might win, but you could not beat that feeling of Obama. Right. Like, it was, you kind of saw that coming.
So you went into election day feeling like it's probably Obama.
Yeah.
Okay. I never know. And then I felt confident Joe Biden would win in 2020. I did, even though
I did too.
It was tight. So all those things happened.
Have I ever told you where I was when I found out Biden won?
No.
Because this was it was the depths of COVID. I was working in the White House. I had decided I wanted Trump to lose maybe a month or two prior. Before that, I didn't even have time to think about the election. But it wasn't counted on election night. We didn't know who won. It was very clear that it was leaning toward Biden, but it wasn't until, I believe, the Saturday after that they actually officially caught it. And it was the most anticlimactic thing. I was sitting in my living room, I had CNN on, and Wolf Blitzer announces it. And I was just like, okay. And my husband was at home. I had no one to talk to, but I lived in a liberal part of Washington, D.C. People were screaming in the streets. Like, within minutes, horns were honking. People were running by with flags. And I was like, all right, well, we lost. It was just such a surreal moment, because usually you lose and you're at campaign headquarters or you win. And I was just like, well, that happened. Moving on.
Right. Well, I mean, and it'll be interesting to see what happens this year. But I remember going through several days of The View, not knowing who had won and waiting, and then it was Saturday, I think, when they called it.
It was
So it's hard to imagine. So basically, this moment, I feel similar to you. I watched some of that rally last night and came away from it thinking, this isn't what America wants. I don't think so.
That's what it is. And the other thing, I want to do a bigger bit on this on the show, but polling, because Whoopi is largely right to distrust it. I've been doing a lot of studying and talking to actual pollsters about the methodology that goes into it, and there is science to it, but it is so imperfect. And what a lot of the modeling relies on is past elections.
Right.
So they survey a certain number of people, and then they extrapolate that to the broader population based on data from another period. But right now is unlike any other cycle. Like, keep in mind that 2024, like right now, in 2020 this time, January 6th hadn't happened. Dobbs hadn't come down. Like, there have been seismic shifts in events that have happened that have changed voter sentiment that I don't think you can measure it based on, and this is where people were at this time last year. So I'll be curious to see, but I still think it could go either way, but my gut tells me she's going to win.
Well, we talked about this on the show today, and former President Trump went on podcaster Joe Rogan's show. And so people have said this is the podcast election because, the call her daddy moment with Kamala. Joe Rogan, the number one podcast there is, obviously behind the table, just moving the needle every single day. But I was reading that he, because I was looking at Twitter, I think it was Friday night, and it was late, and I was looking to see when it went up. And if it goes up, and I went online to watch it, and the first thing out of his mouth,
I couldn't believe it,
is The View.
I think crazy. I text you. I was not watching it. I was in bed watching Beetlejuice with my husband and my dog. Like, this was not what I planned. But I couldn't believe it. So I have this sneaky, don't judge me, I sneaky am intrigued by Joe Rogan. I think that he's a great talker. I think he's a great interviewer. I don't agree with a darn thing he says. But I was a little surprised to start with The View, and then to Whoopi's point, it was sloppy.
It was sloppy.
He got the facts of it. He was off by 4 years of when the visit
he's reacting
happened.
to. It's been a viral meme for a while because I've mentioned I have a text chain of high school buddies, and many of them are Trump people, and they've been sending this to me for months of like, the View used to love Trump, and I'm like, well, first of all, this was years ago before you started saying this stuff, and second of all, no.
It's also like, because I get that a lot on social media. There is a difference. There are plenty of people I like in my personal life that I'd get dinner with. I think, highly of as somebody I'd have a cocktail with that I wouldn't vote for president.
Right.
So merely being nice to somebody at some point, like, that's not an endorsement of like, and you should run the free world.
Well, and the larger implication on all these things is that they only hate him now because they're told to by the Democratic machine or something else.
I think what he said about me later in the podcast.
Well, yeah, we'll do that too. But so the whole thing is just kind of ridiculous. And then I was very happy today to be able to show Whoopi's face.
Whoopi's face was priceless. I mean, it was like what's his name in Abbott Elementary, where the side eye was.
Oh my gosh! I mean, I can only imagine. This was before I worked here. President Trump was on the show once in 2015. He was on via phone. It was, again, not a warm conversation, and pretty much the end of him coming on the show. Yeah. Although there's still a week left to the election if you'd like to stop by. But he talked about you on the podcast.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about this on the show today. But, you usually don't like to go into detail about this when he talks about you.
I don't like to respond to him, and it feels so silly saying it feels like punching down when it's the former president of the United States, but it kind of does feel like it. If you give oxygen, some things he says deserve to be called out and warranted. Others are just silly. But this I did want to respond to because it's like the third time recently, second or third time he said it. He really is focused on The View. He made multiple references to where I sit at the table. So like he's clearly aware of who I am, completely misstated my title, and CNN did like a pitch perfect fact check of it. He's like, she was like an assistant press secretary. Like, I was the White House communications director. I oversaw a department with dozens of staff.
Right.
I did hold a title, which is assistant to the president, which is a presidential commissioning that only the senior most tier of staff have. The chief of staff had that title. The national security advisor did. The head of the domestic policy council, for example. So I'm like, maybe you were conflating those things.
You were from the West Wing. You were Toby Ziegler.
Exactly.
That's a huge job.
It was. I just thought it was funny. But what I actually want to clear up is he kept saying I wrote him like these like letters, these private letters, and some of his fans on Twitter will be like, show us the letters, we're going to release the letters. I was like,
God.
No. When you resign from a government position, you issue a resignation letter. I never even gave it to Donald Trump.
No.
I literally just gave it to the press and gave it to the chief of staff. And it was about working in the administration, and I handpicked specific policies I was proud of.
Right.
And
you said you're very proud of your public service. I mean, as you should be.
I will never not be proud. I got to be the spokesperson for the U.S. Armed Forces and the civilian population of the Pentagon. I got to work in the West Wing under the greatest doctors of all time who helped, solve the COVID pandemic. I'm always going to be proud that I got to be part of that. I'm not proud of him, the politician.
No, you're proud that you resigned.
Correct, and that's not who I swore an oath to either.
Right. No, absolutely. No, and this is an old play for him. I don't even know them.
I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, we could go through all the times you spent together, but it's probably best.
Well, that was the other thing is I'm like, I don't even want to spotlight. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm sure we have not heard the last about this because once he gets locked on something, it seems to continue, but we'll see what happens. All right, let's move on not move on or move sideways. Trump came to New York for the big rally at Madison Square Garden. I'm curious because you're a political strategist in many ways. What do you think of the strategy here? What do you think is the idea behind it, and did it backfire?
It totally backfired. It didn't make sense from the beginning, just candidly. He's never winning New York as much as he wants to bluster about it. Right. It is never going red. There are critical battleground states he does need to be into where Kamala Harris is cutting into his margins, North Carolina, Georgia. He needs to be talking to swayable voters. But this gets back to Donald Trump in what he's obsessed with being. He's the, the Queens real estate guy who wants to be the guy who ran Manhattan. And I think he loved the idea of saying, I packed out Madison Square Garden. And that's what a lot of like his supporters were saying yesterday. I saw clips where people were leaving. I said to our staff, it was less packed than the last concert I went there. And I went on the third night of the 1975 playing it. So they packed it out for 3 nights and there wasn't an empty seat in the house and no one was leaving before the set was over. So like, congrats, you're
the 1975 might have been there.
Right, yeah. I was like, congrats, you're less popular than many bands.
Yeah.
But so strategically, there was no reason to be there or do it other than Trump's own vanity and desire to speak to like a New York audience. But then it just went off the rails. And when these events are planned, maybe I'll talk about this tomorrow on air at greater length, but they choose who the speakers are. They usually vet the speeches. Most of them appeared to be on teleprompter, which means the campaign was aware of things that were said. So they're like, we want Hulk Hogan to make some misogynist digs at Kamala Harris, and we want this comedian, if we can call him that, to make these super racist jokes about Jews, Palestinians, Latinos, and everyone else. Like, that was programming they chose to build.
Right.
And there's, for whatever reason, they thought that was the closing message that they should end the campaign on. And that's what gives me hope that people are like, this is not who we are as a country.
I mean, I even if you believe that they didn't know what he was going to say, that also is a huge red flag.
That's like, an absolute, it'd be an absolute neglecting of any sort of advance work.
Right. It's not who you want running the country.
Oh, and I found it very rich that a lot of Florida Republicans came out and were like, this doesn't speak for us. We stand with the Puerto Rican community. But Donald Trump called America a garbage can last week. Like, I get that now you care about people's votes, but why not care about our country that he's constantly denigrating?
No, absolutely. There was definitely a panic yesterday, reading statements and things like that. So, and justifiably, I think. All right, today we had Mika Brzezinski on from Morning Joe. She issued a dire warning to the American people. She was very worked up, and she was talking about what another Donald Trump presidency would mean. What did you think of her?
So I think super highly of Mika. And we don't agree on a ton politically, but she's a brilliant person. What stuck out to me was her point about billionaires. And I don't mean it's not to single out any one person, but what I often get pushed back from when I'm warning about the dangers of a second Trump term is we've got our institutions, we've got the independent press, we've got all these checks, don't worry about it. But when some of the wealthiest people on the planet are lining up to kiss the ring because they are afraid to get on his wrong side, they're afraid that they're going to suffer, their bottom line's going to suffer because he's going to have some sort of retribution toward them, that should kind of tell us all that we need to know, because the average one of us doesn't have that. The average poll worker who's going to have their life destroyed because of things he said, or even just normal citizens. That stood out to me. I also, just on a personal note, I've always really loved what Mika's doing with Knowing Your Value. I read her original book, and I was working on Capitol Hill, and I knew I was vastly underpaid compared to a male colleague with the same title, the exact same responsibilities. And it gave me both the courage and kind of the tools to go and advocate for myself. And I ended up getting the raise. And it was a matter of, I think there's built-in biases oftentimes with bosses. Bigger companies are better. This would never happen at Disney, but a congressional office is run like its own little, dozen-person entity. But, she's young. It seems like she's making a lot of money. Where I'm from in Ohio, that's a lot of money for a 25-year-old.
When I was age, I made less than that. That kind of thing.
And I don't even think it was poorly intentioned, but going and advocating for myself and knowing my value was really important. So I always give her credit. I remember I sent her a note about that years ago.
Oh, that's great.
Because nobody's going to ask for it. You have to ask yourself.
She also talked about the Dobbs decision and the idea that will be the deciding factor in the election. I feel like it's ebbed and flowed as far as being the most prominent issue and now some people are saying, at least the Republicans are saying, Trump specifically said it's not a big issue anymore.
He also said childcare costs aren't a big deal. I was like, literally talk to anyone with parents or with kids.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the biggest things. I think what we, the media writ large, myself, got wrong in the midterms was we misread a couple of dynamics and the polls misread them. This was the first election after Dobbs. Women turned out at a higher rate than they traditionally do in a midterm cycle. Election deniers got voted down. So I put it into the box of like the power of the female vote. So you already have a gender gap where women favor Kamala Harris at a greater amount. If they care about, like, I'm personally pro-life, but I care about IVF. I care about my girlfriends having access to care if they need abortions, being able to deal with for like protecting your future fertility, getting the proper care. Like, I think what's happening in some southern states is terrifying. I think that energizes people. I think the character issues, like anyone who watched last night's rally, I think that uniquely with women makes them want to turn out and just turn the page and do something else. So I think it comes down to women in general, like the lies, the meanness, the cruelty, and then the bad policies. Sure. I put it in one kind of umbrella, and I don't think we've properly measured that in polls.
All right. Going back to what you were saying before about billionaires and them bowing down to Donald Trump, you were referring to the Washington Post and the LA Times editorial boards not doing endorsements. What's your overall take on endorsements by media outlets?
So I have an unpopular take. I was a journalism major. I see very little value personally in national outlets giving endorsements. Mm-hmm. The Washington Post endorsing Kamala Harris against Donald Trump will not move one single movable vote. The New York Times endorsing does not move a single movable vote. I do think hyper-local endorsements historically have mattered. So think like the Detroit Free Press or like the New Hampshire Union Leader. Those matter because they tend to be very singularly focused on issues in that immediate community. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot less like ideologically based. It's an endorsement that's not saying, we the editorial board put our finger on the scale because these are our views on X issue. This is the measurable impacts on our community and therefore we're backing this person.
Oh,
historically, that always mattered, but local media, unfortunately, is really suffering. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they that exists in the same way. The thing that I get concerned about with big national endorsements is there's already enough Americans who don't know the difference between the opinion section and reporting.
Right.
And I worry it blurs the lines and it makes some people easier to dismiss really important reporting the Washington Post is doing because they'll be like, oh, well, they're all a bunch of liberals who endorse Kamala Harris. And that's not what it means. Mm-hmm. That said, I think what happened was disgraceful. I think the rationale or the likely rationale for why they didn't do an endorsement after decades is disgraceful. And I'm sorry, like, isn't their tag democracy dies in darkness? Like, right. Darkness is not, you're not helping right now.
And a week before the election. Yeah.
We may have that debate on air because I think Sarah and I feel a little differently about it from a journalism perspective. But I see both perspectives.
Well, tomorrow we have Bob Woodward on, so let's talk about the Washington Post.
Yeah. That'll be fascinating.
Well, we have a viewer question for you. We know we love those. It says, Alyssa, if more Republican politicians spoke like you, maybe we could actually get more work done in the country. How about that? In the recent campaign tour that you've done, has anyone ever told you that they actually changed their mind about Donald Trump because of the personal experience that you've shared with them?
Yes.
Oh, that's great.
And honestly, I've heard that more times than I expected to.
Yeah.
I truly, and by the way, thank you for the wonderful listener question. But I have heard from countless people that they were with him in 2016, they voted for him in 2020, and they just can't now after hearing some of what I've talked about, what some of my girlfriends like Sarah and Cassidy have talked about. And I do think that matters. It's not exaggerating. It's not me saying something because I want it to be true. I have never known so many lifelong Republicans who are not voting for Donald Trump. And it does seem like every day more and more like, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. They're not excited. I'm just going to be clear. These are people who literally worked for like Republican senators and believe in Republican policies, but they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to quietly vote for her.
Right.
That's happening.
And partly I think there's a feeling from some Republicans that this is the way to change the party in a positive way.
That's exactly it. I hear it's as much a referendum on Trump and wanting to force the party to go a different direction. Right. And I think it's absolutely the right strategy. He needs to lose if we have any hope of having a Romney-McCain kind of party in the future, something that I think represents the vast majority of Americans far more than whatever we saw down the street. At
Madison Most Square Republicans Garden. Voting for Kamala Harris this time are not hoping for 2 terms.
And you know what? Yeah. She has even said this. She's like, I consider these votes on loan. Like, they're people who are turning out for me. I hope it does mean she's going to, if she wins, work across the aisle and stick to some of these sort of bipartisan moves she's made. But I think she sees it too as like, she doesn't need to forever have my vote, or like Democrats don't need to forever have my vote. It's about turning the page if they get it.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have today, but thank you for joining me, Alyssa.
Thank you.
Check our episode description for the number to call or text us. Tomorrow, I'll be back with Sunny Hostin. We'll be 1 week out from the election. How about that?
Oh, screwed.
It's coming either way.
See you then. Either way.